The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Smithfield Regional Archive in rural Pennsylvania, casting long shadows across rows of archival boxes stacked neatly on metal shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dimly lit back rooms. Sarah Mitchell had worked as the head archivist at this modest institution for nearly 12 years, and in all that time, she had developed a profound respect for the stories hidden within faded photographs, crumbling letters, and forgotten documents that local families donated when cleaning out their attics or settling estates. Her days followed a comfortable rhythm of cataloging, preserving, and occasionally displaying pieces of local history that connected the present generation to their ancestors who had built this small corner of America during the industrial boom of the late 19th century. She took pride in her work, believing that every photograph and every letter represented a human life that deserved to be remembered, honored, and understood within the larger tapestry of history. On this particular Tuesday in early October, Sarah received a call from an elderly woman named Margaret Holloway, who lived on the outskirts of town in a Victorian house that had been in her family since it was built in 1887. Margaret explained that she was preparing to move into a retirement community and had discovered several boxes of old family photographs and documents in her basement that she thought might be of interest to the archive. Sarah agreed to visit that afternoon, as she often did when local residents offered donations, knowing that these house calls sometimes yielded remarkable finds that would otherwise be lost to time or thrown away by relatives who did not understand their historical value. When she arrived at the Holloway residence, Margaret led her down a narrow staircase into a basement that smelled of old wood and dampness, where 3 cardboard boxes sat waiting on an old workbench beneath a single bare light bulb that swung slightly in the draft from the opening door. Sarah carefully opened the first box and found it filled with photographs dating from the 1880s through the 1920s, most of them formal family portraits taken in studios with painted backdrops and stiff poses that were typical of the era when photography was still an expensive and special occasion. As she gently lifted each photograph, examining the faces of people long dead, she felt the familiar mixture of fascination and melancholy that always accompanied her work with historical materials. Margaret hovered nearby, pointing out various relatives and sharing fragments of family stories that had been passed down through generations, though she admitted that much of the detailed history had been lost when her grandmother passed away in 1968 without writing down the stories she used to tell. Sarah nodded sympathetically, having heard similar regrets from dozens of families over the years, and continued her careful examination of the collection, making mental notes about which items would be most valuable for the archive and which were too deteriorated to save. Near the bottom of the second box, Sarah discovered a photograph that immediately caught her attention because of its unusual composition and the strange posture of one of the subjects. The image showed a family of 5 standing in front of a wooden farmhouse with a peaked roof and narrow windows, the kind of modest structure that working-class families built throughout rural Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. The photograph was dated 1889, in faded pencil on the back, and it depicted a stern-looking father with a thick mustache, a mother in a dark dress with her hair pulled back severely, 2 daughters in matching pinafores standing rigidly beside their parents, and a boy of about 10 or 11 years old positioned slightly apart from the others on the right side of the frame. What struck Sarah as peculiar was the way the boy stood with his body angled awkwardly, his right shoulder pulled back and his left arm hanging stiffly at his side, while his right arm disappeared entirely behind his back in a position that suggested he was holding something he did not want the photographer to see. Sarah held the photograph up to the light, squinting at the details, and felt a small flutter of curiosity in her chest that she had learned to recognize over the years as the beginning of something interesting. The boy's face showed an expression that was difficult to read, something between defiance and fear, and his eyes seemed to look not at the camera but slightly to the side, as if he were watching for someone's reaction. Margaret peered over Sarah's shoulder and remarked that the photograph showed her great-great-grandparents, the Carpenter family, who had owned a small farm outside Smithfield in the 1880s and 1890s. Though she knew little else about them, except that they had eventually lost the farm during the financial panic of 1893, and moved into town where the father worked at the steel mill until his death. Sarah asked if she could take the photograph back to the archive for proper preservation and documentation, and Margaret readily agreed, saying she was glad that someone who cared about such things would be looking after her family's history. As Sarah carefully placed the photograph in her preservation folder and thanked Margaret for the donation, she found herself already wondering about the boy in the picture and what he might have been hiding behind his back that day in 1889. Back at the archive, Sarah placed the Carpenter family photograph on her examination table under the bright LED lamp she used for detailed inspection work, and she spent the better part of the afternoon studying every inch of the image with a magnifying glass. The photograph itself was in relatively good condition despite its age, printed on the thick albumen paper that was common in the late 1880s, with only minor foxing around the edges and a slight sepia tone that gave the entire scene a warm, amber quality. Sarah carefully documented the visible details in her notebook, recording the clothing styles, the architectural features of the farmhouse, the bare dirt yard that suggested modest means, and most importantly, the peculiar positioning of the young boy whose name she did not yet know. She measured the angle of his body, noted the tension visible in his left shoulder, and traced with her finger the line where his right arm disappeared behind his torso, trying to calculate from the shadows and proportions what size of object he might have been concealing from the camera's unblinking eye. Her initial assumption was that the boy might have been holding something innocent, perhaps a toy or a small animal that his parents had ordered him to put away for the formal photograph. But the more she studied his expression and the reactions of the other family members, the less convinced she became of that simple explanation. The father's face showed no warmth or patience, only a hard severity that suggested a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, and the mother's eyes held a distant quality, as if she were looking through the camera rather than at it, her thoughts somewhere far from the dusty farmyard where her family stood assembled. The two daughters appeared younger than the boy, perhaps 7 and 9 years old, and both of them had positioned their bodies slightly away from their brother, creating a subtle gap in the family line that might have been accidental, but seemed upon close examination quite deliberate. Most intriguingly, the father's right hand, which hung at his side, was clenched into a tight fist, the knuckles visible even in the aged photograph, suggesting tension or anger that he was barely containing during the time it took for the photographer to prepare his equipment and capture the image. Sarah knew that family photographs from this era often revealed more than their subjects intended, capturing moments of genuine emotion and family dynamics that people tried to hide behind the formal poses required by the long exposure times of early cameras. She had seen photographs that inadvertently documented domestic tension, economic hardship, illness, and grief, all visible in the subtle details of posture, expression, and spatial relationships between family members. This photograph struck her as one of those revealing images, and she felt increasingly certain that the boy's hidden object and the family's collective tension were connected in some way that would only become clear through research and investigation. She decided to begin by trying to identify the family members by name, hoping that census records and local histories might provide context for whatever drama had been unfolding in the Carpenter household during that summer or fall of 1889. The Smithfield town records from the 1880s and 1890s were incomplete, as was common for rural areas during that period, but Sarah had developed relationships with genealogists and historical societies throughout the region, who often helped her with research. She sent a scan of the photograph to 3 colleagues with a brief note explaining that she was trying to identify the Carpenter family who had farmed outside Smithfield in 1889, and she requested any information about the family composition, economic circumstances, or notable events that might have involved them. Within 2 days, she received responses from all 3 contacts, and their information began to paint a picture of a family that had struggled through the economic uncertainties of late 19th century rural Pennsylvania. The father, Thomas Carpenter, had purchased his small farm in 1881 after working for several years as a laborer in the local quarry, and he was known in the community as a harsh disciplinarian who ruled his household with an iron fist and had little patience for what he considered weakness or disobedience in his children. The census record from 1890, taken just a year after the photograph was made, listed Thomas Carpenter as 38 years old, his wife Mary as 35, and their children as Emma, aged 12, Clara, aged 10, and Daniel, aged 11. Sarah felt a small thrill of satisfaction at having names to attach to the faces in the photograph, and she immediately focused her attention on Daniel, the boy who had hidden something behind his back. She searched through local newspaper archives, school records, and church registers, looking for any mention of Daniel Carpenter, and after several hours of tedious work, she found a brief item in the Smithfield Weekly Chronicle, dated November 1889, that made her sit back in her chair with a growing sense that this photograph might contain a story far more significant than she had initially imagined. The newspaper item, just 3 sentences long, reported that Daniel Carpenter, age 11, had been sent to the Western Pennsylvania Reform School for Boys, following an incident at his family's farm that had resulted in the intervention of the county sheriff and the local magistrate. The mention of a reform school immediately shifted Sarah's investigation in a new direction, and she felt the familiar excitement that came with discovering that a seemingly ordinary photograph contained evidence of a dramatic story that had been forgotten by everyone except perhaps a few elderly residents who might remember family legends passed down through generations. Reform schools in the late 19th century were institutions designed to house children who had been convicted of crimes or who were considered incorrigible by their parents and the legal system. And being sent to such a place at age 11 suggested that Daniel Carpenter had done something serious enough to warrant removal from his home. Sarah knew that records from reform schools were often difficult to access due to privacy concerns and institutional record-keeping practices that varied widely during that era. But she also knew that Pennsylvania had maintained relatively good documentation of its juvenile justice system, and she decided to contact the state archives in Harrisburg to see what information might be available about Daniel Carpenter's time in the reform school system. While she waited for a response from the state archives, Sarah returned to the photograph itself and began the process of digital restoration that would allow her to examine details that were difficult or impossible to see with the naked eye in the original print. She used a high-resolution scanner to create a digital file of the image, then opened it in specialized software that allowed her to adjust contrast, enhance shadows, and isolate specific areas for detailed examination. This kind of digital forensic work had become increasingly important in historical research, and Sarah had seen numerous cases where modern technology revealed details in old photographs that completely changed historians' understanding of significant events or individuals. She focused first on the area where Daniel's right arm disappeared behind his back, adjusting the shadow details and contrast to see if she could discern the outline or shape of whatever he had been holding. After nearly an hour of careful adjustment and enhancement, Sarah began to see something that made her pulse quicken, with the realization that this investigation might be leading somewhere truly remarkable. The enhanced image revealed what appeared to be the edge of a small, leather-bound book protruding slightly from behind Daniel's right hip, visible as a dark rectangular shape that contrasted with the lighter fabric of his trousers. The book appeared to be roughly the size of a personal diary or journal, perhaps 5 inches tall and 3 inches wide, the kind of item that a child might use to record private thoughts or observations. Sarah zoomed in further and enhanced the area around Daniel's hand, and she could just barely make out what looked like his fingers gripping the book tightly, holding it close to his body, as if protecting it from discovery. The position of his arm and the tension visible in his posture suddenly made perfect sense, and Sarah realized she was looking at a boy who was desperately trying to keep something precious or incriminating hidden from his parents and from the permanent record of the photograph. The arrival of a thick envelope from the Pennsylvania State Archives 3 weeks later provided the context that transformed Sarah's theory into documented fact. The envelope contained photocopies of admission records, disciplinary reports, and released documents related to Daniel Carpenter's 18-month stay at the Western Pennsylvania Reform School for Boys from November 1889 through April 1891. The admission form, filled out in the precise handwriting of a court clerk, stated that Daniel had been committed to the reform school by order of the Blair County Magistrate, following his father's complaint that the boy had engaged in persistent disobedience, had stolen property belonging to his father, and had created disturbances in the household that his parents could no longer tolerate. The specific property mentioned as stolen was described as a personal journal containing private family information that Daniel had taken from his father's desk and refused to return, despite repeated punishments, including confinement and physical discipline. The form noted that Daniel maintained that the journal belonged to him and that he had written it himself. But his father insisted that any property in his household belonged to him by right, and that Daniel's refusal to surrender it constituted theft and rebellion that warranted institutional intervention. Sarah read through the documents with growing fascination and a deep sense of sadness for the boy whose defiant act of protecting his own writing had resulted in his removal from home and his confinement in an institution that was known for its harsh discipline and regimented routine. The reform school records painted a picture of a bright, literate child who struggled with the institution's rules, but who also earned praise from teachers for his reading ability and his skill in composition classes. One teacher's note from March 1890 mentioned that Daniel had asked permission to keep a journal during his time at the school and had produced a remarkable account of daily life in the institution, though the note also mentioned that the journal had been confiscated when another staff member deemed some of its contents inappropriate and critical of the school's administration. The pattern was clear and heartbreaking. A child who needed to write, who used writing as a way to make sense of his experience, and who was repeatedly punished for that very impulse by adults who saw his words as threatening or transgressive, rather than as the legitimate expression of a developing mind and personality. The realization that Daniel Carpenter had been holding his own journal behind his back in that 1889 photograph transformed Sarah's understanding of the image from a curious historical artifact into powerful evidence of a child's resistance against authoritarian control and the suppression of his voice. She began to see the photograph not as a neutral record of a family moment, but as a document of conflict, with Daniel's hidden journal representing his claim to an inner life and personal narrative that his father refused to acknowledge or respect. Sarah knew that she needed to find out what had happened to Daniel after his release from the reform school, whether he had survived into adulthood, and whether any of his writings had been preserved, despite his father's and the institution's efforts to destroy or suppress them. She expanded her research to include death records, marriage certificates, city directories, and any other documents that might trace Daniel's path through life, and she reached out to descendants of the Carpenter family, including Margaret Holloway, to ask whether any family stories or documents mentioned Daniel or his fate. Margaret responded with surprising information that she had not thought to mention during their first conversation. She explained that her grandmother had occasionally spoken about her Uncle Daniel, who had left Pennsylvania as a young man and had moved west to Colorado, where he had worked as a newspaperman and had become locally famous for his advocacy journalism, supporting labor rights and education reform. Margaret had always assumed this was a different branch of the family, because her grandmother's stories suggested that Uncle Daniel had been estranged from his parents and had never returned to Pennsylvania, but now she wondered whether this might be the same Daniel who appeared in the 1889 photograph. She promised to search through her grandmother's papers for any letters or documents that might confirm the connection, and she told Sarah that she vaguely remembered seeing an old photograph of Uncle Daniel as a middle-aged man wearing a suit and sitting at a desk covered with papers, looking every bit the image of a confident newspaper editor. Sarah's research into Colorado newspapers from the early 20th century confirmed Margaret's family story in spectacular fashion. She found dozens of articles written by Daniel Carpenter, who had founded a weekly newspaper called the Coalfield Advocate in 1902 in a small mining town outside Denver, and who had used his paper to expose dangerous working conditions, corporate exploitation of miners, and the inadequate education system that kept working-class children trapped in poverty. Daniel's editorials were passionate and eloquent, written in a clear, forceful style that demanded justice and human dignity for people whom the powerful dismissed as expendable labor. Sarah found a biographical sketch published in 1915 that mentioned Daniel's difficult childhood in Pennsylvania. his time in a reform school, and his determination to create a different kind of life built on the principle that every person's story deserved to be told and heard. The sketch quoted Daniel as saying that his belief in the power of the written word had been born during the darkest period of his childhood, when writing in his secret journal had been the only way he could maintain his sense of self against forces that wanted to break his will and erase his individuality. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered that Daniel Carpenter's papers had been donated to the Western History Collection at the Denver Public Library after his death in 1943, and that the collection included not only his professional correspondence and published writings, but also a small leather-bound journal that the collection description identified as his childhood diary from 1889. Sarah immediately contacted the Special Collections librarian in Denver and requested high-resolution scans of the journal, explaining her research and the connection to the photograph she had found in Pennsylvania. The librarian was intrigued by the story and expedited the request, and within a week, Sarah received a digital file containing images of every page of the journal that Daniel had been holding behind his back in that family photograph taken 136 years earlier. As Sarah opened the file and began reading the entries written in a child's careful handwriting, she felt tears forming in her eyes at the raw honesty and emotional intelligence of the boy who had risked everything to protect his right to record his own experience. The journal entries from the summer and fall of 1889 documented a household filled with tension and fear, where Daniel's father used physical punishment freely and his mother retreated into silence and depression, leaving the children to navigate their father's unpredictable anger with no protection or support. Daniel wrote about hiding in the barn to read books borrowed from a sympathetic schoolteacher, about comforting his younger sisters when they cried after being struck for minor infractions, and about his growing conviction that the life his father offered was not the only possible life, and that education and words could be tools for building something better. The entries were not always grammatically correct, and sometimes repeated themselves as Daniel worked through his thoughts and feelings, but they revealed a remarkable capacity for reflection and moral reasoning in a child who had been labeled as incorrigible and defiant by the adults in his life. The final entry, dated October 1889, described his father discovering the journal and demanding its surrender, and Daniel's decision to refuse despite knowing the consequences, because surrendering the journal would mean surrendering his sense that his thoughts and feelings mattered and deserved to exist. Sarah spent the next several days transcribing the journal entries and cross-referencing them with the historical records she had gathered about the Carpenter family, and the resulting narrative presented a compelling case study in how 19th century family structures and legal systems treated children as property rather than as individuals with rights and voices that deserved respect. She began to envision a project that would use Daniel's photograph and journal as the centerpiece of an exhibition exploring childhood, resistance, and the historical struggle for children's rights in America. Sarah drafted a proposal for the Archive's Board of Directors, outlining how the exhibition would combine the physical photograph, reproductions of journal pages, reform school records, and Daniel's later writings to tell a story that would resonate with contemporary audiences, grappling with questions about how society should treat children and adolescents who challenge adult authority. The proposal emphasized that Daniel's story was not unique, but rather representative of thousands of children whose voices were suppressed or erased by families and institutions that prioritized obedience and conformity over individual development and expression. The board approved the project enthusiastically, recognizing that it would bring attention to the archive and would fulfill the institution's mission of preserving and interpreting local history in ways that connected past and present. Sarah was given a budget for conservation work, reproduction materials, and publicity, and she was authorized to reach out to other institutions and scholars who might contribute to the exhibition. She contacted experts in childhood history, juvenile justice reform, and 19th century social history, and she was gratified by their eager responses and their offers to contribute essays and contextual materials that would help visitors understand Daniel's experience within broader historical patterns. She also reached out to descendants of Daniel Carpenter, including Margaret Holloway and several cousins who lived in Colorado, to invite them to participate in the exhibition planning and to share any family stories or materials they might have preserved. The descendants' responses revealed that Daniel's act of defiance in 1889 had created a lasting division in the Carpenter family that persisted across multiple generations. Margaret and the Pennsylvania relatives knew almost nothing about Daniel because his parents had effectively erased him from family memory, speaking of him rarely and only to cite him as an example of what happened to disobedient children. In contrast, the Colorado descendants had grown up hearing stories about Daniel as a hero who had stood up for his beliefs and who had built a successful life despite the trauma of his childhood, and they maintained a fierce pride in his achievements and his principled refusal to be silenced. The two branches of the family had lost contact during the 1920s and had no idea of each other's existence until Sarah's research brought them together. The contrast in how the two family branches remembered Daniel illustrated how historical narratives are shaped by perspective and values, and Sarah decided to incorporate this theme into the exhibition by presenting both versions of the family story and inviting visitors to reflect on how families construct and transmit memory across generations. As the exhibition development progressed, Sarah made another significant discovery that added a crucial dimension to Daniel's story. While researching the Western Pennsylvania Reform School for Boys, she found records indicating that the institution had been the subject of multiple investigations during the 1890s following allegations of abuse, neglect, and excessive punishment of the children in its care. Several boys had died under suspicious circumstances, and multiple staff members had been dismissed for cruelty, though the institution itself had remained open until 1924, when it was finally closed after a scandal involving financial corruption and systematic mistreatment of inmates. Daniel's reform school records included disciplinary reports documenting that he had been subjected to solitary confinement on 3 occasions and had been physically punished multiple times for infractions including talking back to staff, refusing to work, and attempting to organize other boys to protest their treatment. These records confirmed that Daniel's time in the institution had been genuinely traumatic, and that his later advocacy for vulnerable children and workers had been rooted in his own experience of institutionalized cruelty and injustice. Sarah incorporated this darker aspect of the story into the exhibition plan, deciding that it was essential to be honest about the full context of Daniel's childhood, rather than softening the narrative to make it more palatable for audiences. She worked with the exhibition designer to create a space that would allow visitors to encounter Daniel's story in stages, beginning with the seemingly innocent family photograph and gradually revealing the layers of conflict, suffering, and ultimately resilience that the image contained. The exhibition would include an interactive element where visitors could read selected journal entries and listen to audio recordings of actors reading Daniel's words, creating an immersive experience that would make his voice present and immediate, rather than distant and abstract. Sarah also planned to include contemporary materials about current debates over children's rights, juvenile justice, and the treatment of young people in institutional settings, drawing explicit connections between Daniel's 19th century experience and ongoing struggles that continued into the 21st century. The exhibition, titled Hidden Voices, A Child's Rebellion in 1889, America opened at the Smithfield Regional Archive on a Saturday morning in September, exactly 136 years after the Carpenter family photograph had been taken. Sarah had worked with a professional exhibition designer to create a space that guided visitors through Daniel's story with careful attention to pacing and emotional impact. The entry wall featured a large reproduction of the original photograph printed at 4 feet wide, with subtle spotlighting that drew attention to Daniel's unusual posture and the suggestion of something hidden behind his back. Visitors were invited to study the photograph and note their observations on cards before proceeding into the exhibition space, creating an interactive element that encouraged close looking and personal interpretation. The next section revealed the digital enhancement process, showing how modern technology had made visible the outline of the journal that Daniel had been holding, and providing the first hint that this seemingly ordinary family photograph contained evidence of a dramatic conflict between a child and his parents. The heart of the exhibition consisted of 3 connected gallery spaces, each focusing on a different phase of Daniel's life. The first gallery, titled The Hidden Journal, displayed high-quality facsimiles of journal pages, alongside transcriptions and contextual information about family life and childhood in rural Pennsylvania during the 1880s. Visitors could read Daniel's descriptions of daily life on the farm, his observations about his family members, and his evolving understanding that his father's harshness was not normal or acceptable, but was rather a form of abuse that he needed to resist. Audio stations allowed visitors to hear Daniel's words read aloud by a child actor, whose voice gave emotional immediacy to entries that described fear, confusion, and the gradual development of a moral framework that would guide Daniel throughout his life. The gallery also included historical information about literacy and education in working-class families, explaining how unusual it was for an 11-year-old boy from Daniel's background to possess the reading and writing skills evident in his journal, and highlighting the role of the sympathetic schoolteacher who had encouraged his intellectual development, despite his father's indifference or hostility to education. The second gallery, titled Reform and Resistance, documented Daniel's 18 months in the Western Pennsylvania Reform School for Boys, and placed his experience within the broader context of 19th century juvenile justice and the Reform School movement that claimed to rehabilitate troubled children but often subjected them to treatment that would now be recognized as abuse. The gallery included official records from the institution, photographs of similar reform schools from the period, and excerpts from investigation reports that exposed the harsh conditions and frequent violence that characterized these institutions. Sarah had worked with a historical consultant to create text panels that explained how the reform school system reflected societal beliefs about childhood, class, and the appropriate methods for shaping young people into productive citizens, and how those beliefs disproportionately targeted children from poor and immigrant families, while middle-class children who engaged in similar behaviors were more likely to be treated with leniency and understanding. The gallery did not shy away from the difficult reality that Daniel had suffered during this period, including details about the physical punishments he endured and the confiscation of his second journal. But it also highlighted evidence of his resilience and his refusal to internalize the messages about his worthlessness that the institutions sought to impose. The third gallery, titled Finding His Voice, celebrated Daniel's adult life and his career as a journalist and advocate, displaying selections from his newspaper articles, editorials, and personal correspondence that showed how he had transformed his childhood trauma into a lifelong commitment to social justice and the protection of vulnerable people. The gallery included photographs of Daniel as an adult, showing a confident, dignified man who bore little resemblance to the frightened boy in the 1889 photograph, except for an intensity in his eyes that suggested his early experiences had left permanent marks on his character and his worldview. Visitors could read letters Daniel had written to labor organizers, education reformers, and other journalists, in which he articulated his belief that democracy required not only political rights, but also economic security and the freedom to develop one's capacities without being crushed by poverty or oppression. The gallery also included a display about Daniel's family life, showing that he had married, had 3 children, and had created a household that reflected his values of respect, education, and open communication, deliberately building a family culture that was the opposite of what he had experienced as a child. The final section of the exhibition brought the story into the present with a reflection space titled Voices That Matter, where visitors were invited to consider contemporary issues related to children's rights, family authority, and the treatment of young people who challenge adult power. The space included information about current debates over corporal punishment, juvenile justice reform, and the ongoing struggle to create systems that protect children while also respecting their developing autonomy and voice. Visitors could contribute to a community board where they shared their own reflections on Daniel's story and its relevance to current concerns, and Sarah had arranged for the archive to collect these responses as a form of contemporary documentation that would become part of the historical record. The exhibition concluded with a quiet room containing a single object, the actual leather-bound journal that Daniel had been hiding behind his back in the 1889 photograph. On loan from the Denver Public Library and displayed in a climate-controlled case that allowed visitors to see the worn cover and the faint traces of a child's handwriting visible through the slightly parted pages. The response to the exhibition exceeded Sarah's expectations and demonstrated the power of a well-documented individual story to illuminate larger historical patterns and to generate meaningful public conversation about issues that remained unresolved more than a century after Daniel Carpenter's act of defiance. During the first weekend alone, more than 300 people visited the archive, far exceeding the usual attendance for local history exhibitions, and the visitors represented a diverse cross-section of the community, including families with children, educators, social workers, and elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents had told about harsh childhoods in the late 19th century. The comment cards and community board contributions revealed that many visitors saw connections between Daniel's experience and contemporary concerns about how society treats children and adolescents, with multiple people noting parallels between 19th century reform schools and current juvenile detention facilities, and others reflecting on their own experiences of having their voices dismissed or suppressed by adults who wielded authority without accountability or empathy. Local and regional media picked up the story, and Sarah found herself giving interviews to newspaper reporters, radio hosts, and even a television station from Pittsburgh that sent a crew to film the exhibition and interview her about the research process that had uncovered Daniel's story. The media coverage emphasized the dramatic elements of the narrative, the way modern technology had revealed the hidden journal in the photograph, and the remarkable trajectory of Daniel's life from abused child to influential journalist and reformer. Several articles drew explicit connections to current debates about parental rights, children's autonomy, and the balance between family privacy and state intervention in cases of suspected abuse or neglect. A columnist for a statewide newspaper wrote a thoughtful essay arguing that Daniel's story illustrated the danger of treating children as property rather than as developing persons with legitimate interests and perspectives that deserve consideration. And the essay generated substantial online discussion with readers, sharing their own experiences and opinions about how families and society should navigate conflicts between adults and children. The exhibition also generated interest from academic scholars who saw Daniel's journal and life story as valuable primary source material for research on childhood history, family dynamics, and social reform movements in late 19th and early 20th century America. Sarah received inquiries from professors asking permission to bring their students to view the exhibition, and she arranged special tours and discussions for several university classes studying topics ranging from American social history to juvenile justice reform to the history of journalism. A professor of education history from a university in Philadelphia contacted Sarah with a proposal to collaborate on an edited volume of essays that would use Daniel's story as a case study for exploring how education and literacy functioned as tools of both oppression and liberation in working-class families. And Sarah enthusiastically agreed to contribute a chapter describing the research process and the decisions involved in creating a public exhibition about such sensitive material as child abuse and institutional violence. Perhaps most significantly, the exhibition created an unexpected reunion between the Pennsylvania and Colorado branches of the Carpenter family, who had been separated for nearly a century. Margaret Holloway and her cousins traveled from various East Coast locations to attend the exhibition opening, and they met for the first time with Daniel's great-grandchildren, who flew in from Colorado for the event. The meeting was emotional and complex, as family members grappled with the different versions of family history they had inherited and the pain of recognizing how Thomas Carpenter's cruelty had created wounds that had never fully healed across multiple generations. The Colorado descendants were gracious but firm in their insistence that Daniel had been the victim and the hero of the story, while the Pennsylvania descendants struggled with feelings of shame about their ancestors' behavior and with questions about how much responsibility later generations should feel for wrongs committed by people long dead. Sarah facilitated a private conversation among the family members before the public opening, and she was moved by their honest discussion and their shared commitment to honor Daniel's memory by acknowledging the full truth of what had happened, rather than perpetuating either silence or sanitized versions of the past. The exhibition's impact extended beyond the immediate community, when photographs of the installation and excerpts from Daniel's journal began circulating on social media platforms, reaching audiences far beyond Smithfield and Pennsylvania. Advocacy organizations focused on children's rights and juvenile justice reform shared the content with their followers, using Daniel's story to illustrate historical roots of contemporary problems and to argue for systemic changes that would prevent similar abuses in current institutions. Teachers began requesting permission to use the exhibition materials in their classrooms, and Sarah worked with the Archives Board to develop an educational resource packet that would make the content accessible to schools throughout the region. The packet included lesson plans aligned with state curriculum standards, discussion questions about primary source analysis and historical interpretation, and age-appropriate selections from Daniel's journal that teachers could use to help students understand how individual experiences connect to larger historical patterns and how people in the past wrestled with moral questions that remain relevant in the present. As the exhibition continued through the fall and into winter, Sarah observed that different visitors connected with different aspects of Daniel's story, depending on their own experiences and concerns. Parents often lingered in the section about Daniel's childhood journal entries, and Sarah overheard multiple conversations in which mothers and fathers discussed with each other or with their children how they would handle conflicts over privacy and autonomy in their own families. Several parents told Sarah that the exhibition had prompted important conversations at home about trust, respect, and the difference between appropriate parental guidance and controlling behavior that violated a child's developing sense of self. Educators were particularly interested in the role that the sympathetic schoolteacher had played in Daniel's intellectual development and his belief that education could be a path to a better life. And several teachers commented that the story reinforced their commitment to recognizing and nurturing the potential they saw in students whose home lives might not provide support or encouragement for academic achievement. Social workers and child welfare professionals saw Daniel's story as a powerful historical precedent for current efforts to reform systems that still too often fail to protect vulnerable children or to hear their voices when they report abuse or mistreatment. Several professionals working in juvenile justice told Sarah that they planned to use Daniel's story in training sessions to help staff members understand the long-term impact of institutional cruelty and the importance of creating environments that support healing and development, rather than simply imposing discipline and punishment. A psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma wrote to Sarah after visiting the exhibition, noting that Daniel's journal entries showed remarkable resilience and that his ability to maintain a coherent sense of self, despite his father's attempts to break his will, illustrated protective factors that contemporary trauma research had identified as crucial for recovery from adverse childhood experiences. The psychologist asked permission to use Daniel's story in professional presentations about resilience and recovery, and Sarah agreed on the condition that the focus remain on understanding historical context rather than diagnosing historical figures using contemporary psychological categories. The exhibition also prompted difficult conversations about the limits of historical research and the ethical responsibilities that come with excavating and displaying evidence of personal trauma and family conflict. A local minister wrote a letter to the newspaper, questioning whether Sarah had the right to expose private family matters and suggesting that some things should remain buried out of respect for the dead and their descendants. The letter generated responses from other community members who argued that historical truth had value even when it was uncomfortable, and that understanding how families and institutions have failed children in the past was essential for preventing similar failures in the present. Sarah responded to the controversy with an essay explaining her methodology and her ethical framework, emphasizing that she had obtained permission from all living descendants before proceeding with the exhibition, that she had consulted with experts in trauma-informed education and museum practice to ensure the content was presented responsibly, and that she believed Daniel himself would have wanted his story told as a way of validating his experience and advocating for other vulnerable children. The controversy ultimately increased attendance and deepened engagement with the exhibition, as people came specifically to see what the debate was about and to form their own opinions about whether the archive had made appropriate choices in presenting such sensitive material. Sarah arranged for several public programs that created space for community conversation about memory, history, and the uses of the past, including a panel discussion with historians, ethicists, and family members that explored questions about who has the authority to tell historical stories and what obligations researchers and institutions have to the people whose lives they study and display. These programs revealed substantial disagreement within the community about how to balance respect for privacy and protection of reputation against the value of historical truth and the need to confront uncomfortable aspects of the past. But they also demonstrated that most participants valued the opportunity to engage seriously with complex questions rather than accepting simple answers. By the time the exhibition closed in March after a 6-month run, more than 2,000 people had visited, making it the most successful program in the archive's history. Sarah compiled a detailed report for the board documenting attendance figures, media coverage, educational programs, and visitor feedback. And she included recommendations for how the archive could build on this success by developing additional exhibitions that used compelling individual stories to illuminate broader historical themes. The board agreed to make the exhibition materials available in a traveling format that could be borrowed by other institutions, and several libraries and museums in Pennsylvania and neighboring states immediately expressed interest in hosting the exhibition. Sarah also worked with a documentary filmmaker who had contacted her about developing a short film based on Daniel's story, and she helped the filmmaker obtain permissions and access to the necessary materials while ensuring that the final product would maintain historical accuracy and ethical sensitivity. 6 months after the exhibition closed, Sarah received an unexpected package from an attorney in Denver, representing the estate of one of Daniel Carpenter's grandchildren who had recently passed away at age 93. The package contained a letter explaining that the deceased, a woman named Ruth Morrison, had attended the Smithfield exhibition during its run and had been deeply moved by seeing her grandfather's childhood journal and learning details about his early life that he had rarely discussed with his family. Ruth had apparently returned home determined to organize her own collection of family papers, and in the process, she had discovered a metal box hidden in the back of a closet containing additional materials that Daniel had saved throughout his life. The attorney explained that Ruth's will specified that these materials should be sent to Sarah Mitchell at the Smithfield Regional Archive, with Ruth's hope that they might be useful for continuing research into her grandfather's life and the historical period he represented. Sarah opened the box with trembling hands, not knowing what she might find, but hoping that it would add new dimensions to the story she had worked so hard to document and share. The box contained a treasure trove of materials that filled gaps in the narrative and provided intimate glimpses into Daniel's inner life across several decades. There were letters Daniel had written to his wife during the early years of their marriage, revealing a man who was devoted to his family, but who struggled with nightmares and periods of depression related to his childhood trauma. There was a series of notebook entries from 1915 in which Daniel reflected on the impending anniversary of his father's death and wrestled with complicated feelings of anger, grief, and something approaching forgiveness for a man who had caused him so much pain, but who had himself been shaped by poverty, limited education, and cultural assumptions about masculinity and authority that he had never questioned. There were clippings from newspapers in Pennsylvania that Daniel had apparently collected over the years, documenting births, deaths, and marriages in the Carpenter family, and showing that despite his estrangement from his parents and his sisters, he had maintained an interest in their lives and their fates. Most significantly, the box contained a typescript manuscript titled Lessons from a Hard Childhood that Daniel had apparently written in the late 1930s, but had never published. The manuscript was a memoir covering his first 20 years, from his earliest memories of life on the Pennsylvania farm through his time in the reform school. and his difficult young adulthood, working various jobs while educating himself and developing the skills that would eventually allow him to become a journalist. The memoir was written in the clear, forceful style that characterized Daniel's journalism, but it also contained moments of vulnerability and self-reflection that showed how he had processed his experiences and had consciously worked to avoid perpetuating the cycle of violence and control that he had experienced as a child. In the introduction, Daniel explained that he was writing the memoir for his children and grandchildren, so they would understand the origins of his strong beliefs about children's rights, education, and social justice, and so they would know that it was possible to survive terrible circumstances and to build a good life without becoming hard or cruel in the process. Sarah immediately recognized that the manuscript was a significant literary and historical document that deserved to be published and made available to readers beyond Daniel's family. She contacted the attorney to ask about publication rights, and she learned that Ruth's estate had anticipated this possibility and had granted the archive permission to seek publication while ensuring that any proceeds would be donated to organizations working on juvenile justice reform and children's advocacy. Sarah reached out to several university presses that specialized in American history and autobiography, and she was gratified by the enthusiastic response from editors who recognized the manuscript's value both as a primary source for historians and as a compelling narrative that general readers would find engaging and thought-provoking. A contract was signed with a respected press, and Sarah agreed to write an introduction, providing historical context and explaining the research process that had recovered Daniel's story from obscurity. The book, published under the title Hidden No More: A Child's Rebellion and a Life of Advocacy, appeared 2 years after the exhibition closed and generated renewed interest in Daniel Carpenter's story. Reviews in historical journals praised the manuscript as an important addition to the literature on childhood in the 19th century and on the subjective experience of institutional confinement. Several popular publications reviewed the book as well, and readers responded powerfully to Daniel's voice and his determination to speak truth about his experiences, despite the personal pain involved in revisiting difficult memories. The book became required reading in several university courses on American history and childhood studies, and it was selected by a national reading group organization as a monthly pick, bringing Daniel's story to tens of thousands of readers across the country. Sarah received letters and emails from readers who shared how the book had affected them, with many people describing how it had helped them understand their own family histories or had validated their experiences of surviving difficult childhoods and finding ways to build meaningful lives. 5 years after Sarah first examined the Carpenter family photograph in Margaret Holloway's basement, she stood once again in the archive's exhibition space, but this time she was surrounded by 3 generations of Carpenter descendants who had gathered to celebrate the permanent installation of a small collection dedicated to Daniel's life and legacy. The installation occupied one wall of the archive's main gallery and featured the original 1889 photograph, now professionally conserved and displayed in museum-quality mounting, alongside selected pages from Daniel's childhood journal, examples of his journalism, and excerpts from the memoir that had been published to such acclaim. A touchscreen display allowed visitors to explore Daniel's story in depth, accessing digital copies of documents, photographs from various periods of his life, and video recordings of family members sharing their reflections on what Daniel's story meant to them, and to contemporary conversations about children's rights and family relationships. The permanent installation ensured that Daniel's voice would continue to be heard by future generations who visited the archive, and it stood as evidence that even stories that have been suppressed or forgotten can be recovered when historians commit to careful research and ethical representation. Margaret Holloway, now in her late 80s, spoke briefly at the dedication ceremony, expressing her gratitude that her decision to donate a box of old family photographs had led to such an extraordinary journey of discovery and reconciliation. She acknowledged that learning the truth about her great-great-grandfather's cruelty had been painful and had required her to revise her understanding of her family's history. But she emphasized that truth was always preferable to ignorance, and that honoring Daniel's memory meant being honest about the circumstances he had faced and overcome. Several of Daniel's descendants from Colorado also spoke, sharing stories about how their family's pride in Daniel's accomplishments had been enriched by learning the details of his childhood struggle and by meeting their Pennsylvania relatives who had been separated from their branch of the family for so long. A representative from a children's advocacy organization that had received funding from the memoir's proceeds spoke about how Daniel's story continued to inspire current efforts to create systems that protected children while respecting their voices and their developing autonomy. Sarah's remarks at the dedication focused on the process of historical research and the responsibility that comes with recovering and presenting stories of trauma and resilience. She explained how the project had begun with a simple observation about an unusual posture in an old photograph and had developed into a complex investigation that drew on multiple archives, technological tools, and collaborative relationships with descendants and other researchers. She emphasized that Daniel's story was both unique and representative, a singular individual experience that also illuminated broader patterns in how 19th century American society understood childhood authority and the development of the self. She noted that the story remained relevant because contemporary society continued to wrestle with many of the same questions that Daniel's life raised about the balance between adult authority and children's rights, about how to intervene when families fail to protect their children, and about how to create institutions that support healing and growth rather than inflicting additional trauma. The dedication ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, honoring Daniel and all the children whose stories have been lost or suppressed, followed by the unveiling of a plaque that would be mounted near the permanent installation. The plaque's text had been carefully crafted through consultation with family members, historians, and advocacy organizations, and it read, "In memory of Daniel Carpenter, 1878-1943, who protected his voice when others sought to silence him, who transformed childhood pain into lifelong advocacy for justice, and who reminds us that every child's story matters and deserves to be heard. May his courage inspire us to create a world where no child must hide their truth or fight alone for the right to speak." The simple words captured the essence of what Daniel's story meant and why it continued to resonate more than a century after that autumn day in 1889, when an 11-year-old boy had stood in front of a farmhouse and had made the brave decision to hide his journal behind his back rather than surrender it to a father who did not believe that his son's words had value or deserved to exist. As the ceremony ended and visitors mingled in the gallery, examining the installation and sharing their own reflections on Daniel's story, Sarah thought about the unlikely chain of events that had led from a curious observation about a photograph to this moment of public recognition and ongoing education. She realized that the project had changed her own understanding of what it meant to be a historian and an archivist, teaching her that the work was not simply about preserving old documents, but about recovering voices that had been marginalized or erased, and about creating opportunities for past and present to inform each other in productive ways. Daniel Carpenter's story, hidden for so long behind his back and then behind decades of family silence, was now permanently part of the public record, available to anyone who wanted to understand how one child's act of defiance had rippled across time to touch lives and inspire reflection more than a century later. The leather-bound journal that Daniel had protected so fiercely in 1889 had become a symbol of the power of the written word to preserve truth, to demand justice, and to ensure that even the smallest and most vulnerable voices can speak across the generations to remind us of our shared humanity and our collective responsibility to protect and nurture those who cannot yet protect themselves.